Welcome to the Sarcastic Collector. Today, I want to talk about stamp grading. In my earlier video, I talked about stamp quality and some of the quality levels that have traditionally been used to categorize stamps. But that's not good enough, because now we have grading. Yes, stamps are now being put to the test, and much like our educational system, our stamps are not scoring very well on their stamp aptitude tests. If you've been around the hobby for a bit, you've probably seen these grading certificates, which provide a numerical value for the stamp, what I refer to as the illusion of precision. You see things like XF90 or 100J. You can now get a stamp that also has a certificate with one of these numbers. This marketing idea may have come from coin collecting, but I'm not sure. I think the reason the hobby market has moved to this numbering idea is because we can no longer trust the average collector to decide for themselves what they like about a stamp. The idea that these average collectors should be running the stamp hobby is absurd, because we obviously must have experts to guide us. And we know who the experts are because, conveniently for us, they put the word expert somewhere in their materials. So now we have numbers, and of course, the importance of this number is so that you can tell someone else who has a smaller number that your stamp is better than theirs. Actually, that would be so gauche. We wouldn't really tell someone that. But for marketers, it is only important that we, the collector, think that. Now, I'm not totally against the concept of stamp grading. I think it can have a role to play as long as we understand what it is and what it isn't. And what it's not is a precise calculation, no matter what using numbers may make it seem like. For example, the grading systems have increments like 80, 85, 90, scores like that. What you never see on a grading certificate is a precise score, like say 83.5. And we can also think back to our basic math classes and the discussion about significant digits, that the precision of the final score, no matter how many decimal places it might have, is no more precise than the least precise value used in the overall calculation. And what we'll see is that many of the values used in these grading calculations are very imprecise. So let us take a look. Before the Bureau got consistent in setting the perforation wheels, the centering of the image portion of a stamp could vary greatly. In my last video, I went over the traditional stamp quality levels. For a lot of collectors, the centering of a stamp is very important. Thus, the primary component of a stamp's quality or value often has to do with this centering. So the numerical grading process, as can be seen here, basically just changes the traditional verbiage, say, very fine, to a numerical number, like 80. So the numbers are a synonym for the traditional categories. If you want to use a number to make this sort of thing precise, then you could scan a stamp at, say, 4K resolution, and then count the number of pixels that exist between the perfs and the image. You could calculate an actual value, where the absolute value of the top minus bottom margin is added to the absolute value of the difference between the left and right margins. This would give you an actual number, where 0 is perfect centering. You could get results like 27 or 19. With the bigger the number, the less centered the design. But the current grading systems don't do that. Now, these grading organizations have detailed explanations on how they go about determining centering. But they're a lot less specific about how they round up or round down their assessment. Their results have to fit into a predetermined 0 to 100 scale. And then furthermore, it has to be rounded to fit in increments of 5, all because having a result between, say, 80 and 85, like 82, messes with the traditional subjective categories. Thus, these numbers have the illusion of being precise, but aren't. They're just a numerical redesignation of the traditional categorization. The argument for these grading systems is standardization, but the hobby has had a set of standardized, recognized categorizations for decades, and this grading system isn't uniform across grading organizations. Here's an example from Ken Lawrence. He wrote in a July 2007 article on the Virtual Stamp Club website. It's a pretty good article on the pitfalls of the grading concept, and it is also worth an entire read. So anyway, Ken sent the same stamp, a C1, to 2 different grading organizations and got 2 different results, with one giving it an 85 and the other giving it a 90. This difference illustrates not only the inherent subjectivity in the process, but also a cautionary issue. Grading organizations charge for their grading services. The reason why people submit their stamp for grading, not just certification, is because they want a good grading score to give their stamp a high monetary value. So if 2 different services, on average, give 2 different results, with one service grading on a curve that's higher than the other, then you would have an incentive to always send your stamp to be graded by the organization that gives the higher scores. The grading organization is also a business, so there's also an incentivized bias to give the customer what they want, a higher score. This would increase the use of their service. Oh, it wouldn't be blatant, but there's always a potential for a hidden finger on the scale. I think we should also look at the concept of centering itself. The reason why centering is important is because of how the centering of the image within the perforations affects the appearance of the stamp. But is that always the case in the grading of a stamp? You see, some stamps require more than one printing pass, and it is quite possible that one printing pass isn't as centered as the other. Let's take a look at the 1901 Pan American issue. These are two-tone, sometimes called bicolor printed stamps. The outer frame design is in one color, and the interior vignette is printed in black. This 2-stage process resulted in misalignments between the outer and inner images, the most famous being the inverts. But we will set aside the inverts for now and look at how this series is handled by our precise numerical grading process. This is US Scott number 298, and we can see that the canal locks vignette sits properly within its frame. Now, note this phonetic foundation certificate with a grade of extra fine numerical 90. The vignette is significantly shifted within the frame. Sure, the outer frame of the image looks well centered in the perforations, but not the vignette. Look at this. The vignette is significantly shifted, yet the stamp grades out at extra fine to superb and a mathematically precise score of 95. If the overall presentation appearance of a stamp is so incredibly important, and I can understand that, we ultimately want a stamp that is beautiful to look at. How do we grade a stamp that frankly does not meet its design intent as extra fine or even superb when the vignette is clearly not centered? Now, I understand the argument that they're just assessing the outer frame image, that vignettes were never part of even the traditional quality level assessments. Yes, maybe, but you're not doing just that. You're giving the stamp a numerical score, which says that this stamp is better than, say, this one. Isn't that in the eye of the beholder? Now, the stamp grading process includes more than just image centering. It also includes assessing a large collection of potential faults, such as pulled perfs, gum disturbance, tears, thins, etc. You can review the various grading methodologies to see their comprehensive list of criteria. I don't have the time in this video to review them all, but they have these additional criteria to adjust the numerical grade up or down. The subjective assessment of the various faults is precisely and mathematically subtracted from the centering score. So again, we can see this is a very subjective activity being tied to a quantitative numerical value. The use of numbers gives the illusion of precision, which is just not present in the evaluation process. I did mention that I think there could be some value in the grading process. I do think that a standardized list of quality concerns is useful to the hobby beyond just centering. For example, you might find one stamp disclosing that it was regummed, or another stamp is stated to have a small thin. But does the regummed stamp also have a thin? There are a whole host of issues and/or faults that collectors are concerned about, and I do think it's useful for certification organizations to all operate off the same list, as well as report their assessment results against the entire list. Right now, there's a sort of implied belief that if a fault isn't listed, then the stamp doesn't have that fault. But was that fault even looked at? You have to dig into the weeds of each service to see what faults they purport to look at, and then trust that none of the myriad of faults wasn't forgotten to be assessed during a hectic and busy time in some evaluator's life. I also think the process can provide some value by its grading on a curve. What? I just spent all this time complaining that the process is not numerically precise, but subjective. Yes, but that's a number problem, not a problem with experienced people sharing their experience for the betterment of the hobby. For example, the centering problem when printing stamps took decades to solve. Therefore, some issues have better or worse average centering than others. I think it is very helpful for folks with a lot of experience to be able to share with the general hobbyist that the centering for a particular stamp is above or below average for a particular issue, because waiting auction after auction to find that extra fine centered stamp may be mostly futile, so it can be useful to know when to cut your losses. But all these technical issues aside, I think my biggest problem with the stamp grading business is that it's a bunch of other people telling you how to enjoy your own hobby. It is one thing to certify what a stamp is. It has a crease, it's been reperfed. It is quite another thing to tell me that it is better than another stamp, that this blotchy fancy cancel is worse than this pristine town cancel, that the personal human involvement of a quill pen cancel isn't as good as a partial circle from an imprinting machine, that a pinhole outweighs two creases. Look at this handy soundness versus centering chart. Note that an extra fine dash superb stamp with a minor fault is equal to a very fine stamp that is faultless. We can also see that minor faults can include things like pinholes, a tiny thin, or some toning. Are people aware that a stamp with a grade of 80 can have these faults? We each collect stamps for our own personal reasons, but by trying to synthesize the entire complexity of philately into a single number of betterment, all you're doing is chasing what's trendy for a group of collectors, with that trendiness at times being driven by the profit needs of the market rather than what's meaningful to an individual collector. For example, for flat plate printed stamps, I absolutely love when the ink from the previous sheet is transferred to the back of the subsequent sheet. The presence of those ink spots creates a nostalgic romanticism for when the stamp was actually being printed, in an if this stamp could talk sort of way. In my mind, I can smell the ink and hear the sound of the presses operating. I will actually pay a premium for stamps that have it on the back, and the more of it, the better. But that's me, and none of that is considered in these grading processes. If it is, let me know in the comments. Now, here is a related issue that is considered. Stamps were printed in large sheets and then cut down into smaller sheets. These large sheets would have guidelines to help the cutting process. Consequently, you can sometimes see on stamps remnants of these lines. Not every stamp has them. In fact, a stamp with them is more rare than a stamp without them. Yet the presence of this line can lower the graded score on a stamp. I assume this is because it affects, wait for it, the overall appearance of the stamp. This sort of pickiness I think of as a current style or trendiness concern. I mean, there's an entire concept with coil stamps called line pairs, where collectors are actually looking for a line. So much so that sometimes the line is forged with a marker. Now, I personally like the guideline. It's like the ink on the back of a flat plate stamp. It brings the entire aura of the printing process. At other times, people pay a premium for other printing artifacts, like plate number singles or other printing artifacts in the selvage. So like bell bottoms or shag carpet, what's trendy in one era can be out of fashion in the next. Is the grade of 90 for a stamp a product of its time? Will that number have to constantly be reassessed as fashions change? What's important to the current stamp market of the time? Will that rarer presence of a guideline remnant one day be a sought-after detail? So I can get behind a set of experts certifying what a stamp is, that it's genuine, has a certain set of faults or modifications. Have the experts tell me what my untrained or unassisted eye can't see on that low-resolution image on an auction site. But to give it a number, a subjective number at that, doesn't just imply a precision that doesn't exist, it attempts to tell the collector, note, not the investor, but the collector, what other people think should be collected. What would the graded desirability of, say, a stamp with a Hindenburg postmark from May 5th, 1937? It looks like the paper is a bit toned. I wonder why that is. Too bad. I guess we'll have to mark that collectability down. Well, thanks for listening. I am your sarcastic collector.